former Secretary of State, former Lieutenant Governor, and now he has what could be the most awful job in state government, Commissioner of Administration. So welcome to Jay Dardenne.
You said that as if there's some doubt. There is none, I can tell you, but it's also the best job because it gives you the opportunity to try and change some things that haven't been done exactly right over the years. And so I'm looking forward very much to that challenge. Let me start by introducing this group, and you need no introduction either, but this will be an opportunity for me to formally introduce the press to my communications group, and you know them already. Jacques Berry is our Director of Communication and Policy. Marcia Schuler, who you know very well, is our Policy Manager, and Cody Wells is our Communication Manager. And Kathy Berry, who has worked for me literally for 27 years since I started in public life on the Metro Council back in 1988, has unfortunately decided that it's time to retire. And so she is no longer employed, but she's here, so I have some hope that maybe she'll come back on a part-time basis and help us out. But I appreciate her service for all those years as well. We didn't need to create a doomsday budget. Governor General did that for us. And the budget that we face for the balance of this fiscal year is one that is going to create a tremendous challenge for the legislature as they come into special session. I'll start making some comments about that budget because we have two budgets we'll be dealing with over the course of the next several weeks when the session convenes in a couple of weeks. And the first order of business is going to be to address the current fiscal year budget. By everyone's reckoning, and I say everyone, all the fiscal people involved in state government that we know of, those who work in the Office of Planning and Budget, in my shop, the Legislative Fiscal Office, the House staff, fiscal staff, the Senate fiscal staff, everybody who has examined this budget agrees on one thing, and that is the number, the shortfall that we're facing. So there does not appear to be any disagreement with anyone saying, wait a minute, you've got more money than you're telling us. The consensus is that as we sit right now, our shortfall for the current fiscal year is somewhere between $700 million and $750 million. That shortfall by law must be addressed before the sun sets on this fiscal year on June 30th. Otherwise, we would be in the unfortunate position of having to carry that deficit forward into the next fiscal year. We don't want to repeat that. To what happened last year. We had about $117 million deficit from last fiscal year that the legislature was required to address in the current year, and they did that with the first deficit that had been declared several months ago. So we certainly want to avoid that reality that will take place if we're not able to close the $700 to $750 million gap that exists right now. Many of you know this, but I'll repeat it for the sake of emphasis. That shortfall comes about as a result of poor fiscal planning, I believe, on the part of the previous administration, combined with a shortfall of revenue. For each of the past 8 years, this administration has run into mid-year budget cuts. We've been overly ambitious on the front end and anticipating revenue, or didn't see revenues realized, or had expenditure projections wrong. And this year, it's no different. It's a little combination of both. Just as an example, the shortfall that we see right now in the governmental expenses starts with Medicaid. We have about a $250 million shortfall on what is necessary for the Medicaid budget for the current year. The budget presented by the last administration had zero inflationary growth in it for Medicaid, the first time in history that's ever happened. So there was no anticipated growth in the Medicaid program. The result is what everybody knew or should have known what would happen, and that is through overutilization and not enough money planned, we face about a $250 million shortage in the expenditures for this year for those who present themselves for Medicaid services. TOPS was underestimated by about $20 million. The MFP needs about $20 million, and that is something you couldn't count on because we weren't sure exactly how many students would show up, but because it's based on a student count, the good news is more young people are staying in school. And the result is we have a responsibility through the MFP to pay the school districts for each of those students in school. So that's good news, except that it's bad news in that we have another $20 million obligation to take care of this year. with a few other things built in, including some language in the preamble of last year's budget bill that simply said we would realize a total of $25 million by reductions in staff and unexpected money coming in. It's literally almost that vague, and that money has not, of course, materialized, so that contributes to the current shortfall that we're facing right now. You couple that with the unprecedented decline in revenue that was realized by the Revenue Estimating Conference, not only in November, but again in December, and now we know as well, has not been recognized by the REC yet, but in January, a steady decline of 3 major revenue sources for the state. It comes as no surprise to anybody that the plunging price of oil has an impact on the budget, but it is not the be-all and end-all with the state's financial problems. But oil right now, according to the REC, ought to be coming in, I believe, at about $42 a barrel. I think that number's right. I may be off a little bit, but as we've seen, oil has dropped into the 30s and even gone into the 20s for a period of time. So we know that that number is not going to be met. Sales tax, somewhat inexplicably, continues to decline. And income tax, corporate income tax, in the November REC was recognized as a negative $328 million. Year to date, we are down approximately $200 million in corporate income tax. In other words, we're in the red corporate income tax. More corporations filing tax returns are claiming credits than they are paying taxes. And that is anticipated to continue for this year. We hope it reverses itself, but if it doesn't, it's easy to see when you project corporate income tax as a revenue source and it becomes an expenditure, which as a practical matter it is when you have to write checks and give refunds, you're not going to meet the anticipated budget. All those factors have contributed to the $750 million shortage for the current fiscal year that everyone seems to agree is real. So as we go into this special session, reality tells us that we either have to cut $700 to $750 million in the remaining 3 to 4 months of the fiscal year, or we have to find some source of revenue to make certain that we balance this budget. And this administration is going to tell people the truth. And this administration is going to budget based on real numbers. And so this administration is proposing a series of remedies to this $700 to $750 million problem that involve the use of some one-time money. We won't do it in the next fiscal year, but we have to do it in the current fiscal year to plug the hole, as well as some revenue measures. Now, we have already said we anticipate $128 million by using the constitutionally allowable portion of the rainy day fund that can be captured this year. So we're proposing to take $128 million from the rainy day fund to deal with this short-term problem. We also have proposed taking $200 million from the one-time money that is coming from BP this year to begin the payments for economic losses to the state as a result of the BP oil spill and the economic damages paid by BP to the state. Let me make very clear the fact that this does not involve a nickel of money dedicated for coastal restoration. It is the money paid to the state for the expenditures the state had to realize as a result of the spill. And it will be $200 million this year. Under the settlement, they will skip a year or so and then resume payments of about $100 million a year for 15 or 16 years. So it's a significant amount of money in the out years every year, but much less than what we're receiving now. We're suggesting taking that one-time $200 million that we get this year to offset a portion of the $700 to $750 million. We also will cut an additional approximate $160 million from the current year's budget. Now, when the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget met after the last REC meeting in November, they recognized a $480-some-odd million shortfall in the current budget year. Notified the governor, and the governor presented a plan to alleviate that shortfall. Unfortunately, the plan that was presented carried us into next fiscal year because they actually took some money that had already been used to balance the budget and used it again. So they pushed a $126 million payment to medical vendors into next fiscal year. So it's not going to solve this year's problem. It puts us in another deficit as we begin FY17, but that's one problem we have to realize, and so that was done at the last REC meeting. So we're going to cut another $160 million that has not yet been previously cut, primarily from statutory dedications, but we will also probably have to get into some of the constitutionally dedicated monies, because when the REC meets in a couple of weeks, my anticipation is that we will once again lower the revenue estimate for the same reasons that I just described. We don't think things are going to change dramatically with oil, sales, or corporate income revenue. Therefore, we're going to have to say it's not a $700 to $750 million problem, it's even larger. Now, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we get much better numbers, but our economists tell us don't expect too much. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. So if that's the case, we will notify the legislature of this additional deficit. They will notify the governor, and the governor will propose some remedies to deal with it. It will probably include reaching into constitutional dedications that have not already been tapped, but that still have some room in the current fiscal year. And then we've already talked about the governor's revenue proposals, primarily the 1 cent sales tax. That is not the way we would like to impose taxes on the people of Louisiana, but in the short term, it is the only, if not one of the very few sources of revenue that can be tapped quickly enough to generate the dollars that are needed in the current fiscal year, which ends June 30th. So if the sales tax is enacted, hopefully it can begin being collected in April, May, and June, perhaps March if the legislature acted quickly, but more realistically, April, May, and June revenue from the 1 penny of sales tax, which would generate 200 and some odd million dollars. I don't have that number in front of me right now, but it would help. And there's some other measures that have been proposed, a whole menu of measures that have been proposed that cobbled together help us reach that $700 to $750 million number. If that revenue is not realized, if the legislature decides it does not want to support any sources of new revenue, then I have already alerted every cabinet official, all new for the most part except for a couple, that they will be required to go in and identify at a minimum 5% of their remaining budget for the calendar year. And we've also asked higher education and health care to each identify what could be as much as $131 million in cuts. In health care, 131, in higher ed, 131, to make up the difference of what will be necessary to get to that $700 to $750 million figure. And you've seen the reports of how they've responded to that request, and it ought to be alarming to every person in Louisiana. Literally higher education saying we would have to, in some cases, declare financial exigency, in other cases, cancel summer school, make significant reductions in a very short window of time to find that money. The healthcare option is no more attractive. They have essentially said all we can cut is within the Medicaid budget, and we would either have to cut part of the deal with the public-private partners or cut optional services under Medicaid, or some combination of the two. Optional services are those that are not required by the agreement with CMS, but states can choose to provide to their citizenry. Louisiana, frankly, has had a very generous series of optional programs, but they've been in place for a long period of time and people are used to them. For example, hospice, dialysis, developmental disability waiver programs, all would be on the chopping block if we're not able to find some revenue stream in the short term, and also would have to be considered in the long term as well. Now, I want to make a couple of comments about one of the suggestions that has recently been made by the state treasurer and senatorial wannabe, who seems to have a great deal of observations about what government ought to do. And his suggestion is that if we simply cut 156 statutory dedications out of the budget, we would somehow find $480 million that we would have to help address our short-term problem. And I looked at and listened to exactly what he said because I wanted to make certain that I was responding in an appropriate way. And his suggestion has been simply eliminate these statutory dedications. which in my mind means you no longer provide the services that are funded by those stat debts. Now, a statutory dedication is nothing more than a legislative act that directs state general fund dollars. So if you eliminate stat debts, you are eliminating the funding that goes with those programs or services, or you must simply replace them with general fund dollars. So I must interpret his suggestion that we simply eliminate these statutory dedications as a sense that he just thinks we ought to eliminate these programs. I won't go over all of these, but I'm providing all of you a list of the stat debts, or a partial list of the stat debts that apparently are recommended for elimination. And I want you to listen to just what a few of them are and tell me if you think it makes sense that Louisiana should simply eliminate these programs. Because if you don't eliminate them, you're going to simply go look to the general fund to fund them, and you will not have saved the money that the treasurer claims we could save and not have to raise any revenue. The first one on the list is interesting. It's $12 million in bonded indebtedness for LAFA, the Louisiana Agricultural Finance Authority that Bob Odom created, and that Commissioner Strain has struggled to correct, and he's done a great job of it, and we've bonded some indebtedness to make sure we take care of that debt. The first one on the list is $12 million that apparently the treasurer thinks we don't have to spend to meet the bonded indebtedness that his bond commission approved. The Forestry Productivity Fund, a small one, $2 million, that restores Louisiana forest land when timber is cut. The Telecommunication Fund for the deaf. I believe we ought to provide services for those deaf people in Louisiana to be able to answer the telephone and communicate. The Tobacco Trust Fund, almost $39 million. I guess he believes we don't need the Cancer Center in New Orleans, or the Tobacco Free Living Program, or the DARE program, all of which are funded with this stat debt. The Parimutuel Live Racing Facility Gaming Control Function, $7.8 million. Pays the entire budget for enforcing gambling in Louisiana, or gaming in Louisiana. State police, attorney general, everybody that regulates gaming is funded by statute by this particular fund. The 2% Fire Insurance Fund generates $29 million. It pays for workers' compensation insurance for every volunteer fire department in the state of Louisiana. They don't have workers' comp insurance if this money is not used. The Natural Resource Restoration Trust Fund, this is the biggie, $113 million. All this does is fund the Regional Restoration Planning Program for 5 major projects funded by the Restore Act. These are the beginnings of coastal restoration in Louisiana. The Golden Triangle Marsh Creation Project, the Mississippi River Reintroduction into Maurepas Swamp Project, the Biloxi Marsh Living Shoreline Project, West Grand Terre Beach Nourishment and Stabilization Project, and the Lower Mississippi River Management Program. These are funds that have been dedicated to start the process of restoring Louisiana's coastline. The Louisiana Fire Marshal Fund, $21.6 million. It funds the operation of the State Fire Marshal. Rehabilitation for the Blind and Visually Impaired. It funds the Center for the Blind in Ruston. Amnesty Collection Fund. Now, this is one-time money from the amnesty program that already has been allocated by the legislature to the Medicaid program that's already $250 million in the red. The Public Oyster Seed Ground Development Account. That funds major projects to stabilize and recreate oyster reefs along our coast. And finally, an aggregate of a number of items on the list that are sales tax dedications for tourism and economic development purposes in literally every parish of the state, or virtually every parish and major city in the state. The legislature has redirected some sales tax from hotel occupancy to local governments to promote themselves. And I've stood at this podium many times and talked about the value and the importance of tourism. If we don't fund these stat beds, we don't have Paul Rigo, which might be a good idea, but we don't have the Paul Rigos of the world that are out promoting our community, and Paul's not going to like that because he recognizes the funds that he gets from that redirection. Aggregated, that's $57 million. So I make this point simply to say that the solutions require honesty and require a candid discussion with the people of Louisiana about the reality of where we are in this state. And that's what you're going to hear from this administration. You're going to get accurate numbers. You're going to get the truth. As hard as it is for a governor recently elected to stand up and say we've got to raise some revenue, and for a legislature to be asked to do what a lot of people think ought not be done. But if they're given the facts and they make an assessment on where we are in Louisiana, that's what we're asking the legislature to do, is to make a candid assessment of what we want our state to look like as we go forward. It's time to be honest about our budget instead of simply telling the people what politicians think they may want to hear. We have a 6-month budget right now in the current budget year. We talked about that a little bit during the campaign, and basically we're running out of money for the current fiscal year, and the legislature is going to have to make some tough decisions in short order to decide how we're going to take care of this problem. In the long term is the next challenge for the legislature when it comes into session in just a couple of weeks. We are going to be proposing, and already have announced, a series of long-term structural changes in Louisiana's tax code, which have been advocated for a long period of time by good government groups and have been specifically advanced in recent months by Dr. Richardson, Dr. Sheffrin in their report that outlined a restructuring of financing in Louisiana. Their conclusions were essentially ratified and confirmed by the Tax Foundation, that doesn't have a dog in the hunt in this debate, looks at it independently from a national standpoint and says what makes sense for Louisiana from a funding standpoint. And their recommendations virtually mirror, in many respects, what the economic report told us earlier. The plans that have been proposed to deal with this long-term issue capture a number of those items. And they're tough decisions for Louisianians to make. We're asking the legislature to make some tough decisions and to give the people of this state an opportunity in the fall to address a constitutional amendment that would make a change in federal income tax deductibility that requires a constitutional amendment, which would be the linchpin of the proposals that join with it in saying this is how we think we ought to rethink the way Louisiana creates its tax structure. We have to do something. Otherwise, we have right now, as we sit, a $1.9 to $2 billion problem in next year's budget. A general fund of about $8.9 billion and about $2 billion of it is not going to be realized, according to all the numbers we see. So when I sit before the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget, which I had the good fortune to chair during my days in the Senate, I will be presenting a budget on behalf of Governor Edwards that is stark reality. We will present a balanced budget. There will be no contingencies. There will be no above the line and below the line items. We will say, this is the doomsday scenario that we as an administration are obligated to present to you based upon the Louisiana Constitution. This is not the budget we want. And in fact, we're going to accompany the budget with a letter that sets forth what we think ought to be done during the session to prevent that budget from becoming a reality. But the legislature will have the truth, the honest budget that is not based upon fabricated revenues that aren't there, or revenues that somehow we think are going to materialize that we know are not going to materialize. It'll be the real deal. If you want to spend only the money that we think is coming into Louisiana in FY17, here's the budget, and it's not pretty. And legislators are not going to like it, and the public is not going to like it. But we're also going to say, tell us what you think is a better way to do it. Give us your ideas. Give us your suggestions. We don't claim to corner the market on good ideas or ways to address this. And we want to have a real dialogue with the legislature. And we want to have a real dialogue with the leadership in the legislature and the leadership in the House, which chose on its own to elect a good man, Taylor Barra, as its Speaker. And he has appointed his Finance Committee, his Appropriation Committee, and his Ways and Means Committee chairman, who are going to have a big hand in doing this. And their names will be on this budget as well. So they have an interest in wanting to make us successful, I hope. And I spoke to the House Republican delegation this morning in Lafayette and told them essentially what I'm telling you right now. And asked them and welcomed their suggestions on what needs to be done. And told them that I don't think they're going to like what that budget looks like with the projected revenues right now. And they'll hear from an awful lot of folks who are not going to like it either, because it's still in the development stage, but I can tell you it is an eye-opener, and it's not anything that any of us in Louisiana would be proud to have enacted into law. It will require unprecedented, dramatic, profound changes in the delivery of service at every level of government, most notably higher education and health care, which do not have the same level of protection in the Constitution that the MFP has and supplemental pay has and several other items have. So by the very nature of the problem, the most vulnerable are going to get hit in this budget if there's not some alternative brought forth. So we agree, unfortunately, with what the reality of the numbers may be, and we'll have a genuine, hopeful discussion about how we think we ought to fix this. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. I told the members of the legislature this morning, I've told House members and Senate members, we want to have a very open dialogue about what we do and where we want to go as a state. And I have always tried to do that in the jobs I've had, and I've had an open door policy, and I'm still going to have it. And let me just mention, because I just realized that in introducing my staff, I believe we have to lead by example, and that's what I've tried to do in my positions as Secretary of State and as Lieutenant Governor. And though the salary I am being paid is more than my predecessor was being paid, the salaries that I will pay my unclassified staff in the Division of Administration will be down about close to $400,000 as a result of a shuffling that we've done to eliminate some assistant secretaries, to not fill a position or two, to pay a little bit less in certain areas, so that overall the Division of Administration leadership salaries aggregated are going to be less than what they were during my predecessor's administration. So I think that's an important thing to do, and so we're going to try and lead by example. The governor is going to have some reductions in the executive staff as well, and so that's an important message that everybody needs to understand. And we'll be asking the new cabinet secretaries, when they are called upon to make cuts in their departments, to do so by looking at two things primarily. First, consulting contracts, because we agree that we have too many consulting contracts. We simply don't have time right now in the rush of this session to try and have the kind of study that I want to have about these contracts, but we will between now and next year, to look at those consulting contracts that may be able to be cut, and to look at the least performing or least important programs that are within a particular department and seek to eliminate them rather than simply cut everything across the board. That will be a challenge for a lot of the new secretaries who have just been on the job for a week or so. They're obviously familiar with their areas, but they are new and they haven't had a time to make a full evaluation. But nonetheless, we're going to ask them in short order to try and answer that call if it becomes necessary. So with that, I will stop and answer your questions. Yes, sir.
Since Treasurer Kennedy is not here to debate with you on that issue, I'll kind of serve as a surrogate. I noticed that you didn't address the Medicaid spending. He has stated before this press club that according to Public Affairs Research Council, there were 900,000 emergency room visits for non-emergency care. If you accept that figure from the Public Affairs Research Council and you infer an average cost of $1,000, which I would believe is conservative, that would be $900 million. He also said it costs roughly 5 times the amount to deliver those services in an emergency room versus that of a private care physician. By my computation, that would be $720 million that the state is expending that it need not have to do if it installed things such as a patient navigator that he referred to at a Houston hospital. Would you care to address those cost savings that Treasurer Kennedy has said that this state can make that I didn't notice that you addressed in your opening comments? Thank you.
I think he's exactly right about wanting to drive Medicaid patients out of emergency rooms, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's the most expensive care that has to be provided, and the way to do that is to make certain you have enough physicians who are willing to see Medicaid patients, to develop them in some kind of a primary care model that they're used to, instead of running to the emergency room every time there's a problem. And so that is an accurate statement, and one of the objectives we would have, and that's part of what Bayou Health is designed to do, and frankly that's part of what I think Medicaid expansion, if it happens, will also be designed to do, to create a plan that can provide Medicaid patients the same type of primary care that most of us that have insurance enjoy. That's a cost saving, and it's the appropriate thing to do for the Medicaid recipient. So I agree with him on that.
Well, can I have one quick follow-up? Sure. Then? If the Medicaid system is already strained, as many contain that and you basically verified, because of not enough physicians to fulfill it, would not expanding Medicaid put further constraint on that, thereby potentially increasing emergency room use and driving up the cost that he alludes to even more?
It could, if we're not successful through the Bayou Health program of managed health care, to try and make certain more physicians are incentivized to be able to see those patients, and to create a mechanism for patients to be able to go somewhere first before the emergency room. And I think some of the ancillary clinics that are being set up close to hospitals is going to help that. And I think the hospitals themselves, recognizing that they want to minimize emergency room traffic because they have to treat anyone who shows up at the emergency room, including those who don't have insurance, and they get very minimal compensation when that happens. So I think there's a systematic interest in doing exactly what you're talking about, and that will be something that I hope we're going to be addressing in a very meaningful way.
Okay, thank you.
The sales tax that you were referring to, that Treasurer Kennedy, the local sales tax, is that stuff that people have voted on to assess themselves? Like, are we talking about the penny in the French Quarter or the, I don't know if it's a penny, but do you know what I'm saying? You were giving that long list and you said that there are a bunch of...
So those are, the question, yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, the sales tax I was referring to at the end of my recitation of stat deads, is that something that people have voted on or people have dedicated to some particular purpose? And the answer to that is in many respects, yes. Some of these tourism funds that go to local tourism areas have been bonded for projects in their area. So that's another complication in just saying, oh, we simply sweep these stat deads or redirect the stat deads away from their intended purpose. You're going to have some problems with bond obligations for local municipalities and parishes that have already bonded out that debt. That's why it's not as simple as it sounds when you have a nice little 30-second soundbite. Just do away with statutory dedication, that gets you $480 million. That's not true.
And then Commissioner Dardenne, can you address the salary increases? Where are we? Do you have updated figures on where we are? The state government ones that we think the governor and some other people.
But yeah, I don't have the number. I have seen numbers that tell me it's about $10 million, but I have seen other numbers where people are saying it's 18 and 19. And I really can't validate either of those yet. I've requested that information. I haven't seen it yet, but it's a very significant number that the state is going to have to deal with. And once those raises have been given, we can't rescind those raises. Civil service regulations and rules say that once the raises are granted, you can't undo them. So our only option would be to not annualize those raises in next year's fiscal budget, which would have the impact of saying to the new secretaries in their departments, you're going to have to eat those raises and cut somewhere else in your budget. So we haven't had that specific discussion yet, but I'm afraid we may very well have to annualize those raises that were given at the 11th hour.
Are y'all into long-term specific tax credits are y'all looking at cutting, getting rid of?
There are a number of them. I don't have that list in front of me, but there are a number of them. The inventory tax credit is one of them that we are proposing be reduced on the front end so that you don't get the entirety of the 100% credit that is now granted. There are a couple of other sales tax exemptions, if I remember correctly, that are part of the plan. And it's been outlined, it's been distributed. I did bring that and didn't have that in front of me because I'm focused more on how we spend it rather than how we raise it.
Commissioner, on some of the feedback we're getting from our viewers, they saw the menu, they see the tax increases, but they don't see a lot of specific cuts. I think sometimes when they hear like the inventory tax credit, it kind of goes, over their head. What are some services that the state could probably do without that would save us some money?
Well, I don't have a list for you of services that we've identified since I've been there on things that we can do without. We're going to cut that $160 million on top of the $480 some odd million that's already been cut in the current fiscal year. In next year's proposed budget, believe me, you'll see cuts everywhere. We'll have reductions everywhere in government, and they will be profound. Based upon the anticipated revenue that we have for FY17, you're looking at cuts that may range anywhere from 25 to 40% in various agencies of government. It's that real when you think about an $8.9 billion general fund that is going to be reduced by $2 billion of those dollars. There's no way around the kind of impact on services at every level that will have to be dealt with, and dealt with in a way that respects the constitutional allocation to particular things.
Just a quick follow-up. When you present your worst-case scenario, the doomsday, and then the tax increases that could possibly help it, obviously it doesn't seem like the legislature is going to go for everything. So there's going to be, how confident are you that there's going to be some kind of middle ground?
Well, I'm very hopeful that there will be. We've laid out a menu with the expectation that not everything is going to pass, frankly. I mean, I think we're realistic enough to know that, but we want to lay out as many options as we can for the legislature to address and start meshing the needs of the state with the type of revenue that would be raised, so we can have a very real discussion of where it'll go. And the governor will lay out his proposal of when this money is raised, this is where it's going to go, but it won't be a part of that document. We think that the instrument has to be balanced and has to be based only on what the REC tells us we'll have.
Jay, can you address some of the potential fallout with public-private partners if the first scenario that DHH proposed of the cuts that they have to take would happen? Where would we go with hospitals then?
Well, as you know, the hospitals would have a right to walk away from the contract if they are not paid exactly what is specified in the contract. I'm certainly hopeful that that will not be the case, and we'll have some very frank discussions with the private providers. They fully understand the predicament we're in. In fact, as late as this morning, I was talking to representatives of some of those hospitals about what we may do. They're reading the paper, they're understanding what the problem is, and they know that as we sit right now, the state is simply not going to be able to meet every financial obligation that's laid out in those contracts. And some of those contracts have extremely generous provisions for the providers. It was not, in my view, an arm's length negotiation. It was basically, here's what we want, or here's what we're going to give you. And so the contracts, in many respects, are very generous to the providers, but they are taking on the responsibility of caring for the indigent in Louisiana with the termination of the charity hospital system. So there's a balance there that we've got to find, and we'll have some discussions with them and hope to have them be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
On the other follow-up on the other scenario proposed by DHH with the cuts that would be to hospice and dialysis and the disabilities waivers, because they're not mandated that we do them, aren't we just saying that it's okay to let people die? I mean, dialysis is life continuing.
It is, and it's not okay. And that's obviously, we don't want to do that, but we have to be honest about what the options are if we have this dramatic of a reduction. And these are not going cherry picking the worst possible things to get everybody all in a lather. This is the reality of what we'll have to deal with. It'll either be reducing dramatically or terminating some optional services, which is not a good option and one that we don't want to exercise. Taking some cuts in the area of public-private partnerships that are just getting off the ground and basically saying to the contractual partners, we can't meet our contractual obligation. These are the kind of discussions that we'll have to have. That's why I don't say this to overstate the problem. I say all this so that the public, the legislature, understands the severity of the crisis that we're facing, and I consider it a crisis. Right?
Jay, one of your predecessors said that on my lease that the state could start by stop sending $250 million a year to local government. The new governor is literally comes from generations of local government. Is there going to be a reassessment, not just on the sales tax rebates, a reassessment of where the state is vis-a-vis paying for services that most states are locally funded?
Yeah, I think 250 is a very conservative number. When you look at everything from supplemental pay to revenue sharing to the parish transportation fund.
I think he's just referring to the non-constitutional.
Well, then that's right. That may be that. Well, yeah, it's a huge number, and yeah, that has to be part of the discussion as well. And I think that's part of the long-term discussion. And clearly, what is going to focus everyone on that debate is going to be the desire of a lot of folks in the legislature to repeal the inventory tax, which is the classic example of largesse that is able to go to local governments on the state's nickel. And it's an ill-conceived tax to begin with, but it's one that we recognize we can't simply do away with because of the locals' dependency on the state taking care of them for these many years. And I think that debate, which will probably take place to a large extent during this session, is going to start focusing everyone's attention on what the state does to spend state money on local endeavors. But there are a lot of them, and the locals have obviously become dependent on this. It's not going to be an easy solution either, but in the long term, I think that too is going to be part of the discussion as we reevaluate spending in Louisiana.
Jay, the legislature seems to be the wild card in all of this. You spoke to some of them this morning. What did they tell you?
They didn't tell me anything, they asked me a lot. I was there to answer their questions, and we had a long question and answer session, and they asked me questions just like you're asking. We talked about stat debt, we talked about other dedications of money, and we talked about, they asked about where we're cutting in government, and is this just designed to raise revenue? I mean, there were appropriate questions, but I didn't get a lot of feedback from them. I did individually talk to people who said, we understand this is a problem, we want to try and figure it out. There's certainly not a sense there that the Republicans have gathered together for the purpose of preventing anything from happening by way of revenue. That was not communicated to me, and we're certainly communicating with them to make sure that they understand that if there is not revenue generated, you're going to make a very conscious decision. No revenue, this is what services go. Some revenue, this is what services will be provided. And that's going to be, it is a wild card right now because you have a number of new legislators. You've got a lot of folks on the Appropriations Committee, for example, that are first-time members of the legislature. An awful lot to digest being on those money committees when you're walking in the door for the first time and facing this level of crisis.
Follow up, what's the possibility of gridlock? What if some Republicans, bought Grover Norquist's or drank his tea or his Kool-Aid, and they don't want to raise any taxes, and they don't want to cut, what do you do there?
I hope that possibility is remote, and that we're going to be able to get enough minds together that recognize that would not be in the best interest of Louisiana. And I appealed to them this morning not to bring Washington to Baton Rouge, and not to have a mission of creating the kind of gridlock that has paralyzed Washington, D.C., and made people so uncomfortable with what's going on in this country nationally. We've never had that in Louisiana. Even though we've now shifted to a Republican majority, in my 20-some-odd years around state government, we've never had that kind of partisan gridlock. We always had cooperation. We had Democrat governors working with Republicans. We had Republican governors recognizing Democrats in leadership positions. Now we've got a Democrat governor with Republicans in leadership positions. So this is not just a John Bel Edwards issue. It's a collective issue of the legislative and executive branches. And by the way, we're going to be asking the legislative branch and the judicial branch to take a pretty significant haircut too on their budgets, just like everybody else. And we're hopeful that there's going to be a sense of working together instead of blocking everything for the purpose of some kind of partisan political gain.
Jay, in terms of the selling the public and the legislators on this, are you finding that you're having trouble making them believe the gravity of the situation? Because we've had 8 years where each year there's kind of been this talk about deep cuts, but then it's been papered over, and the budget hasn't gone through with those deep cuts most of the time. Does that make it harder to sell the situation?
I think people realize that the going away present from this 8-year administration is one that's real. And the problem is real, and there's no more one-time money. As we've said before, there's no more smoke and mirror budgets. There's no creating a false sense of security in the budget through one-time money. There's $800 million of one-time money in this budget. Just take that off the table, walking in the door. That's coincidentally sounds a lot like 750 million shortfall that we have, but we are not going to create a budget with that level of one-time money. We may have a little bit of one-time money. I'm not going to say there'll be none, but we're not going to build a budget based upon the fiction that this one-time money is going to continue to be there.
The previous administration cut $700 million from higher education during the last 8 years, and now there's further talks of cuts in higher education. The administrations are saying that they can't handle any more cuts than what they've already suffered. Any thoughts of alternatives, maybe consolidating some of the smaller universities, the 2-year schools, something like that, to ease the strain on bigger colleges?
That's not part of the proposal that's being made right now. And of course, that's been discussed before, and a difficult ride through the legislature that resulted in it not happening. There's some limitations on what you can do by way of closing or combining those universities in terms of what it takes legislatively to happen. So again, in the short-term need to address this immediately, that is not part of the proposed solution. We're obviously, the governor and I are meeting with the Board of Regents group this afternoon that represents all different facets that have come together, the roundtable, the Board of Regents roundtable that they call it, to talk about this very issue and the problems that will befall higher education if we have the doomsday budget, but also saying to them, you've got to continue looking at how you can streamline the delivery of educational services, avoid the kind of duplication that everybody has talked about. And there have been some strides made in that area, but recognize that you're not going to be living in the same environment you've lived in the past. So that forces, I think, some changes on all these institutions.
Jake, would you talk about the logistics? There's a special session, then the regular session. But the regular session, you can't do taxes in, so you're compressing an awful lot of activity in a very short period of time. And it feels like the public isn't understanding the difference between the immediate problem and then the long-term problem that you're going to have to address totally in this compressed period.
But we're trying to make presentations like this as much as possible to make sure people are educated and understand what's going on. But you're right, it's a very brief time period to be able to do an awful lot of heavy lifting for the state. But we have no other choice. Because we can't do revenue measures in the general session, we are restricted to a special session. And if the special session is not successful and we're dealing with the budget that we have in the regular session, I can assure you the legislature will be back in special session until some result is realized. The governor is not going to simply accept that we're going to do the type of devastation to Louisiana that would happen if we adopt the doomsday budget.
One more specific, the stat debt about tobacco-free Louisiana and everything. Everyone seems to concede that the one tax that probably will pass easily is the tobacco increase. Do you need to then look at that whole dedication on this tobacco-free and then the 1 cent and maybe it needs to look?
Well, it will. Obviously, there'll be a legislative discussion about where any additional money raised from cigarette taxes will go, and whether or not it's statutorily dedicated as the previous money has been, or whether it's going to go into the general fund to deal with the problem. My sense is it will be dedicated in some manner or form to health care.
Commissioner Dardenne, you mentioned earlier that your salary was slightly elevated. You then relayed that your staffs would offset that. Melinda wrote an article, I believe it was Melinda, pretty sure it was, recently addressing the salary levels across the John Bel Edwards administration. But what I'd like to focus on in your particular situation, these folks, to the best of my knowledge, have no prior state employment. I know Cody's relatively young. Marcia's had been with the Advocate forever. But I made computations, and I'm going to give the computations to them or to you. You can, if there's incorrect, you can correct me on it. But I used every available public number I had, and it showed that the present value, that is in today's dollars, of your impact on the state employees' pension system, increasing the unfunded accrued liability, would be approximately $615,000. If my numbers are accurate, I'm an inactive CPA, but I'll be happy to correct the figures if I have them, not crunched them correctly. But how would you respond to people that would say that, well, gee, if we've got this big budget problem, what message does it send that upper level brass such as yourself would have this kind of a drain on the state employees' retirement system?
This is a message that the governor decided he wanted the very best person he could find with the experience necessary to get us out of this problem in a fiscally responsible, honest way. And he offered that person, which he did, the salary that I'm making. I didn't negotiate with him. I accepted what he offered me when he called me and asked me. I had planned on being retired, by the way, and had already started moving in that direction. But I thought carefully about it and decided that I wanted to try and fix Louisiana once and for all, and that we have an opportunity to do that. And I'm very honored to be in that role.
Well, I want to commend you on taking an unfiltered question like you just did. That's far more than I can say from the previous administration.
Well, well, thank you, and keep asking. We'll keep answering.
All right.
Can you explain to me, the governor keeps saying, last Friday he said this a lot, that he didn't know how bad the situation was until he got into office. And that is his explanation for why he hadn't said during the campaign that he would maybe have to increase taxes. I know, by the way, that you did as a candidate not take that off the table, so I don't want to necessarily put you in that camp. But I feel like you and the governor are people who are very familiar with the budget. So can you explain, I still feel like I haven't heard, what is so much worse, or what did you not know before you got into the commissioner's seat that you know now that makes the situation so much worse than you thought it was before?
Several things. I mentioned a couple of them. The first thing is, I didn't know. Now, John Bell was in the legislature, but the previous administration did not factor any inflationary increase for Medicaid That's the first time in history that's ever happened. Therefore, the $250 million shortfall in Medicaid that was not contemplated at the time. Secondly, the Revenue Estimating Conference met in November and gave us the first look at this problem, not oil. We knew oil was going down, and that was a factor, but not the factor. But the Revenue Estimating Conference number in November, after the election, after both the primary and the general election, told us that sales tax was not ginning like it should. And that was a dramatic drop in sales tax revenue. But more importantly is that corporate income tax number. You start looking at a $328 million negative number for the month of November that made the economists say, if this keeps up for the remaining months of the fiscal year, because we got 7 of them left, this is where we're going to be in corporate income shortfall. You aggregate all those things, and he's exactly right, and I say the same thing. If you remember during the campaign, he and I'm sure probably Scott and probably David were talking about an $800 million problem. That was kind of the gorilla we were facing, was an $800 million problem. Well, then we've learned there's $800 million in one-time money in the budget, and I don't know if anybody scoured the budget and identified all those numbers like we have now. And I think all that led to the fact that, we thought we had an $800 million problem, that was bad enough. But the reality is it's twice as bad.
We have time for one more question.
Not to belabor the point on salaries, but as I understood it, there for Tim Bartle's money, they had to go to JLCB and say, we're going to do this for 2 jobs. So does the JLCB have to approve these salaries, or does civil service have any input into it?
No. By law, the governor sets the salary of certain people, and they don't have to be approved. The reason JLCB had to get involved with Tim is that the governor wanted to pay Tim $250,000 and couldn't do it because the salary of the commissioner is fixed in the budget. So the salary of those of us in the cabinet and elsewhere will be fixed in the budget. And that's why Tim couldn't get paid more than that and had to be holding 2 jobs at the same time. And as the governor said, and I think he said it well, he had advocated for equal pay for women. And how should he justify a white male lawyer heading the Department of Revenue and being paid $250,000 and a black female lawyer not being paid the exact same amount? Yes.
Jay, just your opinion, reasonable, fair, processing tax come for consideration is totally out of the question.
It's not on the table at all from our standpoint.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.